On the 3rd of August 1592, a Portuguese ship called the Madre Deus was seized, and upon inspection of the ship's hold, the mother of all riches was found. Within the bowels of the Portuguese ship carried jewels and pearls, and gold and silver coins, and amber silk, fine tapestries, 405 tons of pepper, 45 tons of cloves, 35 of cinnamon, 6 of nutmeg, 2.5 tons of the finest perfume, 25 tons of dye, and 15 tons of ebony, and even more importantly, a guide to trading with China and Japan. How did this ambitious privateering raid begin a 3-century-long expansion of trade, conflict, and calamity? Why were pounds exchanged for guilders based on the price of cloves and pepper? And what do heroin and tea have to do with each other? And more importantly, why are there no companies left? Now, when we talk about the East India Company, we normally mean the British Honourable East India Company, which functioned as a state in its own right up until the end of the 19th century. However, there are two others of note: the French, and in my opinion the most important of the three, the Dutch East India Company. The UOC, or the United East India Company, was a result of the first hotly competing merchant groups from around the Netherlands would fund a single high-risk voyage to purchase goods from allied native polities. However, following the English model of a cartel, the Dutch government under Oldenbarnevelt granted a single company a monopoly over all trade with Asia. This was so successful that what are now considered common spices such as nutmeg or cloves were controlled solely by the VOC. The spice trade, although in sheer quantity is negligible compared to today's international trade, the spice of pepper, coffee and such like more than made up for this smaller scale. And the price of cloves and pepper is the main way that historians convert amounts of contemporary pound sterling into Dutch guilders, and I feel this best illustrates the significance of the East India Companies, as for the first time we were no longer using bushels of wheat. And this early monopoly of Eastern trade would propel the Dutch into a golden age, characterised by an expanse in exploration, natural history, and successfully beating Louis XIV. Figures from the period, such as Rembrandt, defined much of Western art, and the decline of the Spanish Empire is due to this same golden age. The division of the Indonesian archipelago, and the naming of New Zealand and Tasmania, once Van Diemen's Land, and the significant Boer or Dutch South African population betray the undeniable significance of the Dutch in shaping the modern states around the Indian Ocean. The British East India Company would never achieve the same economic height as the VOC, although saying they were only worth $14 trillion perhaps betrays their sheer size and scope. In a set of 5 acts from 1670 onwards, Charles II granted the East India Company rights to autonomous territorial acquisitions, to mint their own currency, command fortresses and troops, and near complete political and diplomatic autonomy in the Indian Ocean region. This set of copycat reforms, in line with the VOC's, would allow the company to begin their conquest of the Indian subcontinent, completed by the latter half of the 18th century. Following the 7 Years' War, bloodily consolidate those gains, and then repeatedly bludgeon the first centralised feudal empire in human history over a drug deal gone wrong. Although the brilliant foreign policy of James II and Charles, and the even better fulfilment of these decisions by company officials, English traders gained control over Bengal in exchange for beer. Achieving profits as high as 400% per voyage, the East India Companies were bound to engage in armed conflict, especially as each company, and I quote, maintained that profit must support the cost of war, which came from the trade, which produced the profit. And this animosity carried over into European politics too, with the 4 Anglo-Dutch Wars and the 7 Years' War taking place on a global scale. During the 7 Years' War, the company's armies expanded from 3,000 regulars to a largely native force of over 60,000 in only 20 years. Divided into the presidencies of Bengal, Madras and Bombay, each region was responsible for the recruitment and upkeep of all troops hired. Also, the East Indiamen, which were heavily armed merchant ships, controlled all shipping in the Indian Ocean. Relying on these, rather than the designated warships, was a distinctly Dutch strategy. The war pitted larger and more established British companies against the smaller French company based out of Mysore, and unable to maintain itself financially, the French company quickly became a non-entity and has had little lasting significance outside of Réunion and Mauritius. Any talk about the East India Company, of course, would be incomplete without tea. During the 17th century, consumption both began and exploded to such an extent that by the 18th century, Britain had a huge trade deficit with Qing China, as did the rest of Europe. And so, in 1773, the company created a British monopoly on opium in Bengal by prohibiting the license of opium farmers and private cultivation. And despite the Chinese ban on opium imports, the drug was smuggled into China from Bengal by traffickers and agency houses in amounts amounting to roughly 900 tons a year. And the proceeds of these drug smugglers landing their cargoes at Linton Island, or Smugglers Island as it is now known, were paid into the company's treasury at Canton, and by 1825 most of the money needed to buy tea in China was raised by the illegal opium trade. And in 1838, with the amount of smuggled opium approaching 3,000 tons a year, the Chinese imposed a death penalty for opium smuggling and sent a special imperial commissioner, Lin Zexu, to curb smuggling. The next 20 years saw China brought to its knees in two wars, creating both Hong Kong and Chinese nationalism as we see it today. The Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 resulted in a widespread devastation in India, and many condemned the East India Company for permitting the events to occur. In the aftermath of the rebellion, under the provisions of Government of India Act 1858, the British government nationalised the company, where the Crown took over its possessions, its administrative powers, machinery, and its armed forces. The decline of the company was due to long-term political stagnation and archaic attitudes towards natives began, in its stead, the equally bloody British Raj. After the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the VOC was a financial wreck due to competition from cheap South American and Caribbean sugar and the loss of over spices, and British attacks in Europe and Asia reduced the VOC fleet by half, removed valuable cargo from its control, and devastated the remaining power in Asia. The direct losses of the VOC calculated at 43 million guilders, and loans to keep the company operating reduced its net assets to zero. The Dutch and British East India Companies are big enough to have their own series. An analysis of the historical facts ranges wildly, but I hope I've been able to give an overview of the events and their significance, as well as illustrate some of that nuance. Although these were the two largest, almost every state in Europe had their own trading company, and each with varying success, and some honourable mentions are the Portuguese, who pioneered eastern shipping trade and built the first truly global empire, as well as creating the majority of the colonies seized and then expanded by the Dutch, and the Danish, who were so irrelevant that they don't even feature on most lists. I had to read last night to research this topic. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to support the channel, please leave a like and comment for the algorithm, and if you can't think of anything to say, you can put VOC in the comments. Thank you, and good night.